Well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the IHR Digital History Seminar, our last of the year. I'm very, very pleased to introduce Lizzie Stewart from UEA, from my university as well, who's a PhD student who's in her third year looking at English design landscapes and GIS. And what she's working with Dr. Paul Gooding and Dr. John Gregory at the University of East Anglia. She's also a funded PhD student from Eastern Arc, in particularly in relationship to digital humanities. So I think this is going to be a lovely occasion to really get a sense of how emerging scholars are combining digital humanities approaches, in this case particularly GIS and GIS visualizations, with more traditional historical approaches and historical understandings, in this case particularly of landscape history. So I'm very, very pleased to have Lizzie here, and I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you. Well, hi. Thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. So the first question that people tend to start with these seminars is, am I a digital historian? And I would probably say if you asked me that maybe 4 years ago, I probably would have said no. But I think during the course of my master's and my PhD, I think my willingness to kind of try the technology out and not be fazed by it and see just the potential of it has really helped. But also I've been fortunate to have a very supportive supervisory team from UEA and Eastern Arc, who not only supported my research but also allowed me to learn new technological skills and improve my knowledge of digital humanities generally. So I think that I've hopefully now grown into a digital historian. So I'm here to present my ongoing PhD research. It's not complete just yet, so there are still a few results that need to be calculated, but it'll just be to give you an idea of my subject, which is English design landscapes. And so they looked a bit like Oxnead Hall in Norfolk, and these were landscapes that the elite of contemporary society would have lived. So since my bachelor's degree, I've been trained in landscape history, but I've been developing this methodology since my master's dissertation. So my master's is when I was introduced to GIS, or Geographical Information Systems. So it's useful particularly for landscape historians because it enables us to create, manipulate and visualize data in different forms, different historical data, within its intended geographical location. So when it came to actually choosing a dissertation topic, I was already thinking about country houses, but my interest was piqued when I kind of glimpsed the potential of 3D-GIS. And I saw kind of a resemblance with computer game technology, and it's really improved in recent years in being able to not only recreate environments but simulate experiences. And that's when I realised that little had actually been researched into English design landscapes in terms of experiences, and that using technology and therefore 3D-GIS could actually help. So design landscapes consisted of numerous features. So we're talking about the country house and its gardens, but also the wider estate landscape, which could expand over tens of thousands of acres and encompass parks, woodland and agricultural land. Now, although each area was to be used differently, they all worked together as a collective entity. Now, of course, design landscapes were individually tailored to a landowner. So at Kenilworth Castle, for example, he had a fountain designed specifically to include his heraldic symbols, which is Robert Dudley at Kenilworth. But yet these sites were also microcosms of wider trends from Europe. So at Audley End, its architecture contains both Italian classicist and Mannerist architecture, which are both fashionable during this period. So as a result, design landscapes were composed of recognisable, fashionable features, but they were nonetheless adapted to suit the needs of the individual landowner. So therefore every estate was unique, and consequently the experiences within them were also unique. Now I chose the 16th and 17th centuries in particular because it is generally an under-researched era of landscape design across many disciplines. And the main reason for this is that there is a severe lack of surviving sites to begin with, and this subsequently affects our practical ability to even experience these landscapes today. So in some cases, these landscapes were replaced by later designs, like Lancelot Capability Brown, who created the landscape park at Audley End. And so access to original sites is not even possible. We are fortunate to have some bits of documented evidence of how people may have responded to landscapes in their own words, such as this extract from a letter where a visitor has documented her response of Oxnead Hall. But of course, these are a rarity and they cannot be applied to every single site. So attempts have been made to reconstruct these landscapes, like at Kenilworth. So by recreating the original Elizabethan garden, you can then try and recreate the experiences within them. But of course, the problems with this is that it's achieved by quite invasive means, quite destructive means, and it's also not necessarily a viable option in terms of costs, and it's quite labour intensive as well. So that's why using 3D-GIS can be beneficial in recreating individual design landscapes using a non-invasive technique, but still within its landscape context, and hopefully provide a means of creating new insight on this subject. So there are several senses, of course, which contribute to experience. But for the purposes of this research and the limitations of this research, I'm focusing on sight. So neurophysiologically speaking, sight is considered to be humans' most dominant sense, and so experiences tend to be prioritised through sight. But another reason to choose sight is that these landscapes were designed for aesthetic purposes. In this period in particular, garden designers adopted popular concepts such as geometry. So that included symmetry, order, and proportion, and all within lines of perspective, as demonstrated by Frederick de Vries's sketch. Now, there are also specific vantage points that were created specifically to provide opportunities to view the scenery. So this is a surviving example at Leiden Nieuwbild of a prospect mound, which was built specifically for the purpose of prospecting. So you could also view the landscape from the rooms of the house, but also within garden buildings, park buildings, and other locations within the landscape. Now, of course, viewing a landscape was not necessarily possible from just a stationary vantage point, but you also could move through the landscape, like in Van Leyden's promenade. So spacious walks were also dictated along terraces and even en route to the house via the approach. So there were many opportunities to observe the landscape, and so acts of prospect and promenade will be the focus of my research, to be recreated and analysed at specific sites. So in terms of the main aims of my research and the rough structure of the seminar, first of all, there are numerous disciplines involved within the study of design landscapes. Now, whilst each discipline has something to offer, they can become quite insular and focus on a particular approach, a landscape feature, or a type of primary source. So by using technology as a catalyst, specifically 3D-GIS, I'm hoping to achieve a more multidisciplinary approach. And then, of course, there's been criticism that 3D is not always useful, that they can be just pretty images to look at and only be of benefit for public displays. So what I hope to demonstrate is that 3D-GIS can be beneficial as not only a 3D representation tool, but as an analytical tool as well. And then, of course, in terms of my research question, I'm hoping to gain understanding of contemporary landscape perceptions by exploring prospects and promenades at specific sites. And then the ultimate aim at the end of this is to rekindle research into not only specific sites, but English design landscapes generally, and of course, other historic sites. So, at the very beginning of my methodology, it was necessary to choose certain sites to analyse. So for this, I adopted a regional approach, so that means limiting assessments to a particular region. Now, this is popularly adopted by landscape historians, and as a result, only a few texts about design landscapes actually adopt a regional approach. But even those that do tend to simply catalogue the sites rather than create in-depth explorations of individual ones. So just to demonstrate its relevance to design landscapes, in my research I'm focusing on East Anglia, so the counties of Norfolk, Suffolk and Essex. So I've used GIS to map the locations of 16th and 17th century sites, which I've researched from historic environment records, listed buildings databases and regional catalogues. So the first map then shows what the current conditions of the sites are today. and of course none of them are considered intact. But that map in itself doesn't really look like much now. But I chose East Anglia specifically because in the second map, East Anglia is in a bit of a topographical bubble. So it's a relatively flat landscape compared to other areas of England, so it seemed to be a reasonable area to focus on. But you can also overlay other kinds of data, such as soil distribution map, which is in the third map, and that's when you get to see some patterns emerging. So the most popular locations for design landscapes are on loam and clay soils, with significantly fewer sites on chalky or sandy soils, which is particularly noticeable in West Norfolk. Now, of course, there could be several reasons for this, but the main reason I'm going to draw on here is that claylands and loams tend to be much richer in nutrients and better able to retain water, thus making them more fertile. But of course, this also meant that these landscapes were more desirable and also made them more expensive per acre. And this is why the landed gentry took advantage of this more profitable land and built them within their estates. So it's certainly beneficial to include a regional approach within this research, which can be more easily adopted with the help of GIS. So within East Anglia, I chose 5 sites across a spectrum in terms of criteria, which I hoped would not only fill the gaps in the current historiography, but also see how GIS would respond in different circumstances. So the first was the condition of the site. Some survived to a better extent than others, but others are completely demolished and do not exist, such as Morsham Hall, which is now under the suburbs of Chelmsford. Second was site access and the ability to experience the site firsthand. Only one of these sites, Milford Hall, is owned by the National Trust, whilst the majority of the others are privately owned. So there's no public access and you have to get permission. The third is the status of the landowner. Scholars do have a tendency to focus on more renowned landscapes who own grander estates, but of course there were varying degrees of status. So while some of these were part of the Elizabethan progress, others were local gentry, second sons, and indirect heirs to their family's fortune. So a variety of available sources is also something worth considering, because not every site has the same quantity, quality, and format of sources. Each has its own strengths and weaknesses, but it's important to acknowledge every available source, as well as the approaches of different disciplines. So I'll start off with artistic works, which are certainly a useful source which can depict design landscapes from the eyes of a contemporary. And of course, this is mainly the province of the art historian. So the analysis of individual sites from this period, however, is rarely achieved by art historians, because individual site analysis using these sources alone can be quite problematic. Now, although we see a noticeable rise in paintings being commissioned in correlation with the development of estates during this period, events such as the Civil War caused disruption, and obviously estates were ransacked, and so these paintings are now extremely rare. So the example of Nanak Park in Wales is believed to be the earliest known painting to depict an entire rural estate landscape from a bird's eye view. And of course, this was painted in the 1660s, which is right at the end of my period. But we are fortunate nonetheless to find snapshots of design landscapes in portraits, such as in the background of the Capel family portrait, which is depicting the parterre gardens of Haddon Hall. But of course, paintings not only depicted observations of current landscapes, but also designs for new ones, and even idealised landscapes which do not compare to reality. So at Morsham Hall, there was a sketch created in the 1630s, but the sketch does not actually correlate with an estate map from the 1590s. So of course, I'm looking particularly at the parterre garden, which in the map is depicted to the south, but in the painting it's depicted to the north. So there is a chance that the garden was moved, but there's also the chance that it was never there, and it was just placed for artistic effect. So as a result, these works provide quite a distorted view of the real landscape, not only in terms of its components, but also in terms of its replication of topography and the wider landscape context. So analysing the experience within these landscapes cannot be addressed using this source alone. So that's why rationalising and comparing the data with other approaches and disciplines is necessary. Now, some of the most prominent features in our landscape are architectural in nature, and architectural historians provide the majority of literature on the country house. So some country houses still survive today, like at Melford Hall, where the original architecture can be observed, but you can also compare it to a contemporary floor plan to provide evidence of the original interior design. So this provides architectural historians with a great opportunity to explore architectural theory and the processes of the architects themselves. But the problem is that the country house is one component of the estate landscape. We also have garden buildings, park lodges, gatehouses, and even the villages and churches in the surrounding landscape. Though of course that means that there's less literature on these features. And of course focusing on one particular feature means that observations, including those regarding visual experience, are limited to the house itself. Now, other architectural features beyond the country house are predominantly explored by landscape historians, but I do see potential for growth in using approaches in architectural history within the wider landscape context. Garden history also has a similar problem. As the name suggests, its discipline focuses on the gardens, and that can already be problematic. Garden historians do provide an important contribution by exploring and understanding the symbolism and meanings within gardens using iconographic and literary sources. So this includes elaborate garden plans and gardening manuals. But beyond the garden, to the spatial arrangement of gardens within the wider context of design landscapes is often absent from these discussions. And therefore concepts of experience are also limited to the gardens themselves. Now, of course, another problem is that these gardens were replaced by new styles of landscape design, but certain features such as this fountain from Oxnead still survive. Of course, it now resides in a different location at Blickling Hall. So there has been this misconception that gardens could no longer be seen today, but that was before acknowledging the works of other disciplines, such as archaeology. Now, of course, we typically associate archaeology with ancient civilizations, and of course that's where the majority of the literature resides, including experiments in phenomenology and the experiences within the landscape. But the remains of design landscapes also exist in the form of archaeology, and that's where we can find some good evidence of these landscapes. So in the 1980s, the garden archaeology was first introduced, and large-scale excavations were conducted at the Privy Garden in Hampton Court. Now, the aim of these excavations was to recreate the garden from the time of William III, which is in 1702, but they nonetheless could establish a timeline of activity, such as the remains of a bit of Tudor mosaic flooring, which was left behind as rubble. But what's interesting is that in the top left corner is a later hole dug to build, to plant a tree to create topiary. So archaeology came as a revelation, but of course archaeology was not limited to excavations. So we have earthworks of terraces visible at Stiffkey, but also surviving foundations at Hoxton Hall visible as crop marks on aerial photography. So this approach was not readily accepted by scholars because they were drawn more, there's a certain amount of professionalism with large-scale excavations. But with the emergence of work in earthworks and aerial photography, but also other non-invasive methods such as geophysics, it kind of opened up access to archaeology to other scholars. And that's where landscape history comes in. So by utilising the approaches of the aforementioned disciplines and a variety of sources, we add to the breadth and depth of analysis of design landscapes by creating a more well-informed multidisciplinary approach. And together with our interest in scale of analysis, so beyond the house and the radiating garden schemes around it, but to the wider landscape and the regional landscape context where the site resides, this approach altogether provides a more supportive foundation to analyse how these landscapes were experienced. So the next stage is to use computer science to synthesise all the available evidence and rationalise it, but also to combine the strengths of the approaches of the aforementioned disciplines. So GIS is becoming popular within the spatial and digital humanities. And as I previously demonstrated, GIS is great to identify trends and regional variations, but it also has the capabilities to improve individual site-based studies. So it's the best opportunity to combine, compare and rationalise data to create one cohesive interpretation of an individual design landscape. So as the map on board shows, the first one, that's just a snapshot of the sources that I used. But the fact is, if I put any more in there, it would have looked really, really messy. And I think that's partly the point, is that there is a lot of data, but to try and see it all and try to convey that to others is quite difficult using the sources individually. So by extracting the data from estate maps, archaeological plans and architectural plans, but being corroborated using modern OS maps, as well as listed buildings, ancient tree surveys and historic environment records, we can fill the gaps in the landscape context and extract the data using polygons. Now this can all be stored in a geodatabase, which can then act as a record of the sources that I've used. So as the second map shows, I've created a focus area of about 4 miles in diameter to accommodate for the wider landscape context and its impact on design landscapes. So now the 2D environment is complete, it was then necessary to use the data in a 3D environment for certain reasons. So the main reason to use 3D over 2D is the presence of the z-axis. So 3D more closely resembles how the landscape was perceived compared to 2D. So this is a 3D version of a 2D map of the data I've extracted from Hoxton Hall. And as we can see, it looks quite flat and not entirely realistic. So the first thing I need to do is add topography. Landscapes definitely aren't flat. Every hill and every valley is unique to every location, so which goes back to my regional approach. And of course, we are trying to rectify where contemporary landscape paintings have potentially distorted their actual topography in their depictions. So the data used for this topographical base map is from LiDAR surveys to an accuracy of about 2 meters. So of course this is better displayed and understood in 3D-GIS. Then we need to add the surface features. So from artificial to natural features, they collectively affect the composition of the landscape and the experience within it. So it's important to display both topography and surface features collectively. But of course, despite the 3D nature of GIS polygons, there is something important missing. Now, certain sources may be able to provide us with the location of features which can be easily used in GIS, but there are other more descriptive and detailed sources which GIS is less able to replicate. So these are examples of different forms of evidence which contain information about colour schemes, building materials, heraldic designs, and gardens. So GIS cannot capture the details to the level of accuracy that we would, as closely as possible, replicate what was once perceived in reality. Now, Esri, the developers of ArcGIS, created a new data format called the multipatch. And the purpose of the multipatch was to enable the importation of 3D models created from external software, such as CAD software. So CAD was first developed to enable the creation of single 3D models instead of the previous amalgamation of several 3D drawings in the past. And like GIS, CAD responds to the same X, Y, Z axes, but it also provides a similar platform to rationalize and amalgamate the data into one coherent interpretation. So this is where I started for my master's dissertation, using Trimble SketchUp. So I self-taught myself how to use it, and it was a relatively simple and user-friendly interface, so it suited the purposes at the time. But for my PhD, I wanted to explore other possible software, ultimately improve my skills, but also to reach the standard of modelling that had been accomplished within the heritage sector so far. So this is what I've created using 3DS Max, which is typically used for designing computer games. It's a bit more advanced and more complicated in terms of its interface, but I was fortunate enough to receive training in 3ds Max, along with certain image editing skills from a 3D modeler who, alongside one of my professors, has worked on creating models of heritage sites such as Leeds Castle. Now, of course, if their work is currently on display within their exhibitions and is used to improve visitor experiences of heritage sites today, then this tech should also be beneficial for my research and understanding contemporary experiences. But another reason to use 3ds Max was because its developer, Autodesk, is continuing to develop a strong partnership with Esri between the GIS and CAD softwares. So this provides a perfect pairing for this research in terms of current methodologies, but also more importantly in terms of continuing maintenance and support, which is important and valuable when looking to the future. But of course, CAD models have been criticised as being little more than attractive images. So using 3D for 3D's sake when a 2D environment is perhaps more appropriate in certain cases, and 3D has nothing more to offer. But I think part of the reason for that criticism is the way that CAD is designed. Because the purpose of CAD is to create, edit, and visualize data. It was not originally designed to conduct further analyses. So that's why using 3D models and GIS together is useful. Because 3D-GIS is one of those few systems which is able to provide a solution to both 3D representation and spatial analysis. But CAD is not the only 3D modeling software that is compatible with GIS. If you're lucky enough to have this surviving artifact, you can use photogrammetry to capture it and import it into 3D-GIS. But 3D-GIS at this level is particularly prominent among archaeologists looking to recreate ancient sites. But within the context of design landscapes, it has not been used for both 3D representation purposes and spatial analysis until my master's degree. So 3D models can now be part of the GIS recreation. So we now have the foundations to analyse how design landscapes were experienced within 3D-GIS. Now I've achieved this using two different GIS tools to analyse the popular concepts of prospect and promenade. So I'll start off with prospect, so the act of viewing a landscape from a static vantage point. So using the Diffusion Analysis tool, you can visualise the visibility of the landscape from a particular location. Now, Diffusion Analysis relies on topographical data to calculate visibility. So this is an example from the Piano Nobile, or the first floor of Morton Hall. So the lighter areas are where things are visible, and the darker areas are invisible. Now, this technique has been used in numerous landscape studies, including Bronze Age barrows to medieval castles, and even 18th century design landscapes. But they all do this within 2D GIS to produce something like this. But there are problems that these studies have not accounted for. And the first is that the data sets that we capture are, of course, of our current landscape, and so the data is not truly representative of the landscapes in the past. So these previous studies have used the modern data without editing it to get rid of any obviously inconsistent features. So for example, I've highlighted a motorway. Now we cannot necessarily be certain of every change in the landscape, but I'm pretty sure motorways didn't exist in Elizabethan times. So I've attempted to rectify this by editing the data to ensure the results are more representative of the time period I'm researching. And secondly, they also did not account for adding in contemporary features. So everything from hedgerows to houses to woodland. So using my polygons that I created earlier, you can convert them into raster data and input height value to then merge it into the topographical data. And then you can ultimately replicate the 3D GIS environment as a digital surface model, or DSM.
I think it was just because you had the menu.
Ah, there we go. So as you can see, if we conduct the same analysis again, the results are very, very different. And then we can overlay these results onto the 3D GIS environment for analysis. So we can visualize what was visible and what was invisible, both of which would have had a bearing on experience. And of course, this is all within a navigable environment, so you can highlight or zoom in on particular details up close, or you can see the wider impact across the landscape. Now, as for promenades, I'm recreating these using animations. So we're starting to see great progress in animation technologies, and it has the potential to be of benefit for analytical purposes. So in the context of design landscapes, we are only seeing these in the capacity of creating public displays and exhibitions without scope for analysis. but we're also seeing a lack of inclusion of the wider landscape in these animations. They're only focusing on what was visualized in the immediate grounds. Now, animations are also possible within CAD environments, but when integrated into the GIS environment, the same data set can be used for both animations and viewshed analysis. So I'm not only trying to demonstrate the versatility of 3D-GIS, but also avoiding the risk of distortions between different data formats and inconsistencies between software. So in this example, we see the parterre garden's geometric design from an elevated position, the heraldic colours of the family painted on the waterways, as a previous statement from the account stated. And you can also see that the heights of the walls surrounding the gardens would not have stopped the views over the surrounding pasture and meadowland. Now, whilst each method is useful in their own respects, there is an aspect that neither can achieve, and that is they cannot interpret the data. Now, in the words of a medieval philosopher, Meister Eckhart, subtract the mind and the eye is open to no purpose. So if we are to understand what was experienced through sight, we need to recreate the minds of the landowners who created them. So for this method of interpretation, I'm using perception theory. It's a term used by literary historians involving how printed text affected thoughts and behaviours of people. Now, literary historians do work on fictitious literature regarding landscape design, whether in prose, poems, plays, or court masques. But there's also a wealth of documents in the form of factual material, whether in published works such as farming manuals and architectural texts, but also unpublished material in the form of letters and travel diaries. But these have only been examined and analysed in more recent years. So instead of critiquing the text themselves, I'm using it to bolster reception theory and therefore offer fresh and exciting new perspectives to the study of design landscapes. So as an example, this is the viewshed analysis from the gallery at Stiffkey Old Hall. Now, I've highlighted an area of common land which would have been invisible from the gallery. Now, texts from the period document that common land is where the poorer members of the community reside, but they also say that they considered them to be vermin. So landowners ideally wish to enclose these areas of commons and turn them into private land for their own estates. And this appeared to be the case with Nathaniel Bacon, who owned Stiffkey, where it is recorded in his papers that he was accused of essentially jumping the gun and putting his sheep on the land of a common in Aylthorpe illegally. So the common at Stiffkey was not able to be enclosed until the 18th century. So it is possible to interpret that obscuring an unenclosed common from sight of the house prevented overlooking this area, which was full of vermin and likely considered unsightly. Now, although originating in literary history, art history can be used to assist in reception theory. Now, as previously mentioned, artwork cannot necessarily be reliable when recreating these landscapes in reality, but nonetheless they are useful for interpreting these results because they do document what contemporaries considered to be ideal landscapes. And the landowners who commissioned them may have even sought to achieve it in reality. So this is a snapshot from an animation recreating the ascent of the Prospect Mound at Moultrie Hall. So I've highlighted the visibility of a church in the direct line of sight framed by woodland. Now, even the spire of a church visible within a scene was considered beautiful, and so the placement of the mound took advantage of that view. This was not only the case at Morsham, but also in the painting depicting Albury Park in Surrey. But of course, churches were more than just beautiful. They could also have a religious connection, or act as a status symbol, or even convey a sense of familial lineage to the ancestors who were buried there. And that's why a more multidisciplinary approach, even within reception theory, is also important. But of course, we are talking more not only just about what contemporaries responded to in word and image, but also by who and what they encountered through their social networks and experiences of other cultures on their travels abroad. So these are snapshots from the animation of the approach to the entrance of Stiffkey. Now, I've compared it to Old Gorhambury House in Hertfordshire. So the architecture of Stiffkey resembles Gorhambury, which was the home of Sir Nicholas Bacon, who was Nathaniel Bacon's father. Now, the reason why they look so similar is that the intended plan for Stiffkey was designed in 1574 by Nicholas for his son, and Nicholas also designed Gorhambury. But although due to financial difficulties, the intended plan was never fully executed, and so not only is a comparison between these two sites and these two people beneficial, the use of GIS and 3D-GIS enables you to switch layers on and off to see the transitional phases and possible ideas for these landscapes. Now, the main difference between Stiffkey and Gorhambury would have been the cultural aspects of the architecture. So Gorhambury contained Italian classical architecture in the form of Doric or Ionic columns seen in the left wing of this painting, and the stone used in its construction was imported from Normandy. Now, these would all have indicated someone very well travelled with tastes in European fashion. But the site that Nathaniel eventually created by 1604 was very different. It was far plainer, with no evident cultural influences, and was instead focused more closer to home by using local flint and brick. So on the approach to these two sites, visitors would have had different notions, perhaps regarding their social standing, but also their cultural awareness of the people who lived there. So just to conclude with the aims of the talk, I hope that I've demonstrated the benefits of using a multidisciplinary approach and how technology has been used to achieve this. I also hope I've demonstrated the abilities of 3D-GIS as both a 3D representation and an analytical tool. And I hope that my research will provide a better understanding of visual experience within design landscapes. And so I'll end on my final aim, which is rekindling research into design landscapes. But I don't just mean within the scope of my PhD research. Now that I have created this resource, I hope to share it with others, and it would be a shame to keep the data for myself. Now, of course, the main problem is that access to technology for a wider audience is difficult, whether in terms of the prices of licenses for the software or suitable hardware specifications to run the software to begin with. So that's where WebGL can be used. Esri developed City Engine Web Viewer to enable 3D GIS landscapes to be visualized online. So to use this, I had to learn another technological skill, which was coding web development. So I was fortunate enough to be chosen as one of the 20,000 women being taught how to code with the Code First Skills initiative. So this enabled me to create this website, which I can then host my data. So I hope not only to make the data more accessible, but also to open up possibilities of crowdsourcing, public interactions, and learning opportunities. So in conclusion, I hope that I've demonstrated the value of digital methods within this field to a wider audience. So thank you very much.
Thank you.